What did the pandemic actually change about work, and what did it teach us about the important elements of collaboration and innovation? My guest today is Nick Bloom, professor of economics at Stanford and one of the world's leading researchers on remote work, management practices, and productivity. Here's our talk. Welcome to the Economics of Work. I'm thrilled to welcome Nick Bloom, professor in Stanford and an absolute pioneer in how people work across a variety of different dimensions. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me on, Ben.
We've obviously had a big global pandemic, changes the status quo of how people work. Do you think we have settled on a new equilibrium, or are we still in an adjustment period?
More or less summer 2026. Things at this point have mostly calmed down as regards to the pandemic. I can give you three numbers. In the US in 2019, 7% of full paid days will work from home. So 7% means the average American maybe worked from home one day a month. So it happened, but it's pretty rare. It went up astoundingly to 60% in May 2020. That was the peak. Which 60% is like unbelievable because more than half
that's
of working
especially
days.
given how many workers are in frontline jobs.
Exactly. And it's partly because actually frontline workers lost jobs, and partly because everyone that wasn't not frontline was almost entirely from home. Now it's dropped down to 25% and it's been pretty stable now since kind of mid 2024. So right now, the pandemic effect's over in the sense of, if you were to ask me looking ahead, there's like AI. Actually, currently there's the kind of gas price shock. There's things like that. But I think the pandemic is in the rear window and, we kind of settled to halfway between the peak of the pandemic and before the pandemic.
So one thing I don't fully understand, and I'd love if you could help me understand it, is why have different countries settled on different equilibria?
That is a great question. Actually, I have a very short paper on this. It's an empirical paper with only 40 data points. So what are the 40 data points? We've been running these cross-country surveys on work from home, and we've managed to get, I think, reasonable data for 40 countries. To be clear, it's only for graduates. What do we look at? We look at a range of factors like GDP, so richer countries tend to have more work from home, industrial structure, length of lockdown, etc. That by far the largest factor in accounting for difference is this cultural factor called power distance, which is basically how much people want autonomy versus how much they're accepting being told what to do. So what you tend to see is Anglo-Saxon countries, so Britain, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where typically people don't like being told what to do as much, tend to have more work from home. And if you look at particularly East Asian countries, take Japan, South Korea, mainland China, there's much less work from home. And in this literature, it tends to be more you're accepting of authority. And when you talk to people, the kind of standard explanation, what I've heard a lot is, look, in the US, you're allowed to work from home, but you've got to get your job done. And you'll be evaluated on performance metrics, and I look at how you do. In Asia, there is particularly East Asia, there's more of a thing of FaceTime. I physically want to see you there in the office, and so because of that, work from home is less common.
Yeah. So do you think that if managers want to see you face to face, is that to discourage shirking? Is that like just management as desk watching? I think you coined that term. I think I've heard you say it. And is that the driving force to wanting people in the office? Like what is really the motivation based on that like cultural value?
So generally when I talk to just a ton of companies in the US, partly from exec ed and just visiting lots of companies and talking to managers, vanilla policy would be something like coming in 3 and working from home 2. So there's some definite real benefits from coming in, like mentoring, providing feedback, socializing with your colleagues, be it in culture, etc. But you just don't need to be in every day. And it comes to your question of the reason you don't need to be in every day is people are working fine at home. It's not like they're all goofing off. And why is that? Because managers see what you achieve. When you have a bunch of employees and if when they're at home, they weren't doing anything, it would show up pretty quickly.
Totally. Yeah.
Typically, reasonably well-managed companies, you have folks in, for 2-3 days a week and have them at home 2-3 days a week. In Asia, it's much more skewed towards coming in 4 or 5 days. And I think a lot more of it's around cultural. I remember I had a very good friend in grad school, Toshi, and would tell me when he worked in Japan, he couldn't leave till his boss left. And, the person below him couldn't leave until he left. And he actually complained. He said it was really miserable because he was doing it like these 12-hour days. And when I asked him what he was doing, he said often he's just reading the paper for an hour or 2 every evening. And so that's very much like around FaceTime rather than around performance.
Yeah, interesting. I'm glad you brought up this like 3 days a week versus, full remote versus like fully in office. Those are essentially the 3 paradigms, right? It's like fully in office, hybrid, remote. Do you think there's like a emerging winner in this space? Or do you think there's still like a case being made for fully remote or hybrid?
Great question. So it turns out, so I tell you about Fortune 500 companies. We have great data on them. They're big and they cover like probably half the total labor force. So what you see in a typical big company, roughly 50-60% of employees come in every day. So I think of Stanford, we're not Fortune 500, we have 20,000 employees. We have roughly 10,000 that just come in every day. They're like food service, security, janitorial, transport, nurses in the hospital, etc. They just can't work from home. Then of the other 10,000, about 8,000 are hybrid, like me as faculty or most of our senior staff. And there's a big upside of being in person. You just don't need to do it every day. And then there's about 2,000 that are fully remote. And, when I talk to the fully remote people at Stanford, they're typically doing stuff you just don't need to come in at all. So they may be doing payroll. There's someone I work with for processing grants. You may say, why would Stanford let them be fully remote? The reason is we get much better people for our pay because we're in a really high labor cost area. The person that helps me with my grants, he lives in Illinois, which is low wage. So effectively, we're in this situation whereby if you don't need to come in for labor supply reasons, often you go to fully remote. If you do need to come in, typically it's hybrid. And then for some jobs, you just have to be in all the time. And that final group, I should be clear, is just over half of all Americans.
I sometimes think about hybrid as in some way Pareto optimal to fully in person, but in some way not being able to take advantage of the massive benefit of being able to hire people globally, not having to have real estate. You could save so much money. And I wonder if fully remote is still kind of underrated.
Mike, I'll ask you, how does Revelio operate?
We're distributed. I mean, well, we have an office in New York, but it's really just, I don't know, to get mail if people want to meet up and, sometimes people want to get together. But I felt like we didn't have a choice to be fully remote because during the pandemic, we were still growing and we hired people. And then, I mean, you remember during these times, people went to go live with their in-laws and move out to the suburbs and exurbs. And nobody really knew how long it was going to last. And we had to hire people. So thought, we might as well hire anywhere. And then when people did start coming back to the office, we were already distributed and felt like this kind of mixed mode of some people in the office, some people remote was just weird and sloppy and didn't really make sense. So I never felt like I made a decision to be remote. It just kind of happened.
I mean, one piece of advice I give companies is it's a bad idea to change your policy unless you're really confident. But take Revelio, you're doing very well. You presumably hired a bunch of great people and they've selected to work for Revelio. One of the reasons is they like being able to work from home and have locational flexibility. If you now tell them, hey, you got to come in 3 days a week, you're going to have, 50% turnover. On the other hand, if you're Amazon now, you've been forcing people in 5 days a week for the last 2 years. If you were to go remote, the people who are stuck around in the company maybe don't value it that much. And so there's a few things, but one of them is firms that keep changing their policy. That's a disastrous thing to do because obviously you select people that like your policy. And so I don't think there's one size fits all. It depends partly on how easy it is to evaluate performance. So you can evaluate performance really well. You don't typically need to be watching people. How much you need mentoring. As you have slightly older, more experienced employees, you need less of that. Mostly what I do, as I ask you about Revelio, mostly what we do see is for remote first companies like Instacart, Dropbox, Airbnb, Upwork, they'll typically meet in person maybe once a month. So it's not like they never meet, but that's not the normal default. The normal default is work from home and then sporadically meet in person.
Yeah, that's an interesting move. That's like kind of a form of hybrid in a way. It's just like without the office space, you just like get together all at once. I mean, we go to a lot of industry conferences. So, we sometimes meet each other at conferences, but we don't do like monthly offsites or anything. Yeah, I mean, it kind of brings me to something else I was curious about. And that's this idea of innovation, knowledge spillover. Let me ask you, this idea of serendipitous interactions at the proverbial water cooler, is that like kind of bullshit or is that a real thing?
There's a real thing there. Look, as academics, you have seminars in person. Part of it is what I call a personal trainer effect, is that from everyone that's ever gone to a Zoom seminar, within 10 minutes, you're, checking email, maybe within 20 minutes in person, but, people are much more focused. I personally, for example, when I go in a seminar, I try not to take my phone out and I try to concentrate on that seminar when I'm there.
Yeah.
That's almost impossible when it's over Zoom. It is also, there's stuff that comes up in person. The critical thing for innovation is you, don't need to be in person all the time. So there's actually a great paper in the Proceedings National Academy of Sciences, looks at what's called bursting. It's a randomized control trial and it has groups of subjects try to solve a traveling salesman problem. So like you have someone that needs to go to 10 cities and what's the correct order? And it's one of these very hard problems. And they randomize the groups into group A, they're in person fully for 6 hours. Group B, they're all remote and effectively separate. And then they meet up in the last 10 minutes. And then group C, they're like together for an hour, separate for an hour, together for an hour. And C performs the best, statistically significant. And it's kind of like you need some time together, some time apart. Having said this, coming back to what I said earlier, the other critical thing for innovation is you have good people. And clearly, if it's easier to hire better people because you're more distributed, that's also an important factor. So you may, this is why often when I talk to execs, I'm like, look, if you force people in 5 days a week in particular, you can find very high attrition, particularly people in their 30s and 40s that may have kids. They're critical in this innovation process. And basically, they don't think like an economist. They take the partial derivative, but it's not what you really want. You want to think about if you force everyone in, it's not that you hold the same staff. There's people who are going to quit on you and you're going to end up with lower quality employees.
For sure. So this mechanism of like higher innovation when we spend some time together, some time apart. So we get innovation. And are you thinking of that as kind of the same idea as like knowledge spillover? How should we think about those as distinct, if they should be distinct? And what do we really get from our interactions?
So there are some stuff. There's a paper in Nature by Jonathan Levave and Melanie Brooks that came out a few years ago that, again, did RCTs. They compared people, they gave them a bunch of products, and I think there was like a water bottle and a few other things, and asked them to come up with new ideas for these products. And they discovered that people in person tended to perform better than on Zoom. The main so what from that paper is Zoom is very distracting, and people are kind of distracted by seeing their own face.
Yeah.
It makes it hard to be creative. I talked to Rich Barton, who's the founder and used to be until recently CEO of Zillow. And he was like, well, look, there's a simple solution to that.
Expedia and one other company, right?
Yeah, Glassdoor.
Glassdoor, yeah.
Yeah, and he said there's a simple solution, just turn off your own image. So the innovation thing, partly it's around, coming back to this personal trainer effect, people are concentrating. So they just have a mental image. There's a meeting of 6 people. They're all in one room together. They're basically all looking at each other, all paying attention. Probably nobody's checking their phone. If they are, they're kind of apologetically doing it briefly in case it's their kid for some issue. Whereas if they're all on Zoom or Teams or whatever, you can imagine you've probably only got 50% of concentration. It's not obvious, again, to be clear, the other things they're doing may be productive, but they're probably not paying attention on the meeting. And I think that's one big factor that's driving, and that's probably the major factor. You just have more concentration. But again, if you have 2 or 3 people, whenever I tend to not multitask on Zoom because, I'm not, neither of us are multitasking now. You can kind of tell.
Well, one-on-one, you really can't.
Yeah, exactly right. I think small meetings online work very well, where you tend to run into problems if you have 20, 30 people, because at that point, it's very hard to grab everyone's attention. And that's, I think, the biggest effect. The other thing you hear a lot about is before and after. So before the meeting, you arrive a few minutes early, you chat quietly to someone, and that's when other stuff comes out. Or after, there's something sensitive you don't want to say. But again, it doesn't mean you've got to come in every day. So we had a paper in Nature, we did an A/B test. We had a firm, Trip.com, huge NASDAQ listed firm. We took managers, execs, these are all grads, and we randomized them between coming in 5 and 3 days a week. And what you find is there's no performance benefit from 5 days a week. But what you see is if folks are forced to come in 5 days a week, their quit rate goes up by a third because they don't like it. So for the firm, turnover is really expensive, and it's actually very profitable to be hybrid.
Well, is that just a general effect of coming in 5 days a week, or is it switching from 3 to 5 days a week?
So they were 5 before, and they A/B tested allowing half. They had a sample of 1,600 people, and we did even odd birthdays. So in that case, 5 is a default. So it's hard to know but what you generally find in surveys is people say they value being able to work from home 2-3 days a week, the same as about 6% more pay. So 6% more pay is, it's a lot. It's a material, if you cut pay by 6%, you probably drive up attrition by a third. And that's roughly what you see with hybrid.
Yeah, that's tremendous. That sounds like a stronger, more encouraging result than if it were 3 moving up to 5, because that could just be based on this, a sort of matching mechanism you mentioned before that, now you're forcing people into a situation and you're sort of changing the deal on them. Let me ask you, what do you think we have learned about the nature of agglomeration post-pandemic that we didn't know pre-pandemic?
Ooh, that's a great big. I think I'm about to go and work from home. I was about to say on work from home that it is profitable to let people work from home 1 or 2 days a week. And just to give you a final figure, and then we'll move on to agglomeration. If you look at the Fortune 500 for managers and professionals, 70% are hybrid. So they let them work from home typically a couple of days a week. There's about 25%, a bit under 25% that are fully in person. That's like JP Morgan. And there's about 7-8% that are fully remote. So as you mentioned earlier, it's like every which way. And I don't think there is one size fits all. I think the key thing is to be consistent because you select the employees that went into that system.
Right, right. I mean, you could sort of make the case that that is kind of what the Great Resignation or Great Reshuffle, whatever it's being called these days, was kind of all about. All these firms took on different policies, and people had to match their preferences with a whole variety of different ways of working.
Yeah, and exactly. You asked. Sorry, it's funny. I'm working from home. I'm currently at home right now, so I don't know if
Same. Yeah.
listeners can hear that background noise. It was my son on the phone walking past the room. So on agglomeration, there are still big benefits of cities. I mean, I don't think the benefits of cities ever went away. It's just that you don't need everyone to be living in, working right in the center. There's another thing we've seen with the pandemic called the donut effect, which is because of work from home, a bunch of people have moved out to the suburbs. They take the view, look, if I'm going, take New York, if I'm not going in every day, I don't need to live, in the center. I mean, Ben, how far do you live from central New York?
Yeah, I live about an hour from the city, which is commutable, and a lot of people go in every day. But what I found sort of surprising about your donut results, which by the way, love the name, I was surprised by how far outside of city centers it extended. It's not just commutable distances; it's also 100 miles outside of big cities, right? I mean, how do we make sense of that?
Yes. So, it's all weird. I was just looking, I'll give you something that's kind of live. I was looking at earlier today. So on the donut effect, if you look at roughly the largest 10 to 20 American cities, so this goes everywhere from kind of New York down to Boston, what you see is folks have left city centers, moved out to the suburbs. As you say, some of these suburbs are kind of 50 miles out, 60 miles out. Why is that? Well, they've just made the calculation, look, I'm only going in 2 days a week. I just can live further out. What I was looking at this morning that was really interesting in data is we've been using satellite imaging on NO2, which is a major pollutant. And we see a huge drop in the level of this pollutant, even in 2025 in city centers and suburbs, because people are driving in and out less. And if you do the math, it's looking like it's reducing pollution-driven mortality rates by something like 1,000 to 2,000 Americans a year, which is huge numbers. Why is this? There's just less driving in and out. If you think of when people drive in and out today, central New York, there's a lot of people living in the center of town that are then breathing in all that exhaust fumes. And so there's all kinds of, second, third order effects of this donut effect and increase of work from home.
Cool. That's such an interesting result. Do you think we learn anything deeper about the nature of agglomeration that we didn't know before? I always found agglomeration to be a kind of confusing subject because, I get that there's benefits to, integrated supply chains. There's some consumer preferences to bundle their shopping and then there's, local industry conferences. There's actually people working in the same office. There's meetups. There's all these different effects. And I would think with people working more remotely, you have some of those effects staying and some not. So have we gotten deeper into solving, what are the real drivers of the benefits of cities?
I'm going to channel my inner Ed Glazer. So Ed Glazer is been writing about cities for decades, and he has multiple books on it. He kind of points out, look, cities have been around for I think at least a couple of thousand years. You go back to kind of ancient Athens and these massive cities. And you're right, it's driven by agglomeration. I think he always points out they're amazingly robust. For example, in the early 80s, people said, well, maybe the telephone and then the internet came in the 90s is going to end cities because people are just communicate virtually. And it doesn't really, enough faster transportation doesn't really seem to have happened. What we see in 2026 is a bit of a shift in focus now from cities from 100% on work and some now on more leisure and consumption. So one of the things you see in the data for places like New York is there's more traffic actually going in often in the evenings to kind of eat out, go to good restaurants. So, why are people living in New York? They're living there still because they want to be near work and they're probably going to go in 3 days a week. But they're also living there because it has, great amenities. And so I think agglomeration, maybe in terms of work agglomeration, has gone down a bit, but it's been to some extent replaced by leisure agglomeration around eating out, theaters, museums, etc.
Yeah, I would think that's especially true for younger workers. If you're 22, just graduated college, single, you have to live in a city. Like, you're not going to go live in the suburb. Like, it's very hard to date and be social, et cetera. And, younger people want to go into the office more. I wonder how much of that is driven by the fact that they're kind of in a city anyway, and it's just convenient versus this idea of, getting more mentorship and training. How do you think that breaks down?
There's what I call a U-shaped relationship over how much people want to and do go into the office versus age. So if you look at folks, I've been running this thing called the Survey of Working Arrangement Attitudes for, with Jose Barrero, Steve Davis, Shelby Buckman, a bunch of colleagues at Stanford for now 5 years, and we must have surveyed by this point probably 200,000 Americans. And you see one stylized fact that's so robust and in different countries as well is people in their early 20s actually want to typically go into work 3-4 days a week. When you ask them why, they'll say, first point, look, where am I going to work from home? Because I'm sharing an apartment with 3 friends and I don't really want to work in my bedroom and, there's no quiet living room. Secondly, they want to be social. And thirdly, they want to get mentored. You see folks in their 30s, 40s, kind of early 50s are much more focused on working from home. Typically, they have kids, they have more money, they have a house, they live further out. And then interestingly, the uptick at the end again is kind of 55 upwards. You tend to see people want to go back to the office, and it's basically empty nesters. They're happier going in. And also, fun talking to people, they're just more used to it. And I'm 52, but if you're like 57, 58, most of my career is definitely in person pre-pandemic. And so this is a lot of when I talk to companies, your policy should depend very much on who your employees are. And so, if you have a bunch of early 20 somethings, you maybe want to be in quite a bit. If you have a bunch of 30 and 40s, you probably actually want to be more remote focused or certainly kind of flexible hybrid.
Yeah. That tracks. I teach a course at NYU called The Future of Work. And every time I teach it, I ask the students, like, what would you prefer? Would you rather be in person or remote? And nobody wants to be remote. I mean, at that age, that is just like very unpopular, aligns with what you see.
You're totally, it's funny. I do the same thing. And I've done it, I totally aligned. So with my undergrads, exactly that. With my MBAs, I sometimes teach in the business school. The MBAs, the last time I did that, I said, how many people want to, go into 5 days, 4 days, etc. And 0 days. And I was like, 2 people put their hands up, and I was kind of surprised. MBAs tend to be pretty outgoing, and they said, oh, actually, we want to just work from a beach in Mexico. So their idea was, I guess it's the age group. These are 27-year-olds. So they're not thinking of young kids and stuff. But yes, that age group tends, like below 30, tends not to be, not all of them. Again, we see in the data, we can look in the data and you see kind of 5-10% of that cohort is remote, but primarily you're correct. They want to go in 3-4 days a week.
Yeah, interesting. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about management, because I know you did so much research on management, and which is, I think, rare for economists. So I know earlier we brought up this idea of management as desk watching is kind of, on the decline. In your opinion, what is management kind of standing on one foot, and what should it be?
When I go through this, I have like 2 things that sound related, but I think are really quite different. So one is managers, which is how good the individual are. I follow sport. Many people think about sports like the coach of the team. Is that a really good coach? If it's football, maybe Alex Ferguson or Pep Guardiola. These are people who are, famous, reputation, done very well. I don't tend to focus on that as much because it's kind of hard. You kind of almost need like a DNA scanner to figure out how good this person is and is not. Yeah. If you look in the literature on what's often called leadership, it's hard to get good evidence. It's noisy. So the thing I focus on is the other half of it, which is practices. What do I mean by practices? If you think of companies that are kind of famous and perform well, I don't know, Walmart, Toyota, McDonald's, they have kind of famous set of management practices. And that's what I've looked at. And it's less associated with one person and more like the ethos of the company. And generally, the 2 we've looked at have been around what I call monitoring. So kind of collection of data, analysis of it, and particularly we're focusing on outputs. So it's not like trying to monitor how many hours I work or how many clicks of my mouse, but what I achieve and what I do. And then the other half is what I call incentives. So do good performers get rewards? Do they get promoted? And do bad performers get given feedback, help to improve? And if they repeatedly underperform, get moved out of the firm. And those kind of monitoring and incentives are kind of the big framework to think about management practices.
Yeah. So do you think if you were to spend a day watching a firm, do you think you would know if it's well managed or not? Having done these surveys, like if you were just like a fly on the wall, what do you think would be a good clue that a firm is well managed or not well managed?
That's a fantastic question. I'll tell you why as well. There's a great historical echo to it. So the reason this management work came around was I started working in this in 2002. So this is now almost 25 years ago. It was originally this scoring grid, which we used to evaluate companies. We must have, with Raphael Lusted and John Van Ryn and a bunch of co-authors evaluated, I don't know, at this point, 100, 200,000 companies. That grid originally came from McKinsey. And the origin of that story is around 2000. There was someone called Blair McCallum, who I've never met actually, but he was a kind of manufacturing practice expert in McKinsey, said to John Dowdy, who I worked with when I was at McKinsey and a bit subsequently, Blair said, look, I could walk into a factory and within 20 minutes, I can tell you whether this is well managed or badly managed. I can tell you, I could see it's really obvious. And John Dowdy challenged him and said, well, if that's true, write it down. And so Blair wrote down this 20-question grid, which is really the historical precedent. If you look at the grid, so, to directly answer your question, one thing in manufacturing would be true in retail. It's less true in like financial services, but you typically see performance data out around the facility. So I've worked a bunch in retail. If you go not the bit the customer sees, you go into the back office of retail firms, like in the back store, in the storeroom. There's well-run firms have tons of charts and numbers, figures. You can pull it up so you can tell who's performing and queue length, etc. Yeah. And then the other thing is they will have good performance evaluations. Those are harder to see. If you were to talk to someone for 20, 30 minutes, you could figure it out pretty fast. Like if it's Revelio, I'd say, you're the CEO and founder. So it would be, I'm not sure how independent that would be, but if I was to interview an employee, you'd say, look, imagine, Revelio hired 2 people and one was a superstar and one, was kind of pretty mediocre. 2 years later, would there be any difference? And, hopefully they say, yes, one's been promoted and the other's been given. There's those kind of questions and that kind of concept.
Yeah. So it seems to me like there's a lot of bad management out there. But if these things are knowable, like why does bad management persist?
That is, I'm old enough to call it the $64,000 question, which is, that old game show. That was the key question at the end. Yeah. I've written many papers on this. And it's hard. As an economist, you initially think, well, like there should be no bad management. Everyone should be really well managed. I think partly there's incentives. It actually takes more effort to be well run than badly run. And if you're, government owned or in a protected industry or phenomenally profitable or sitting on some, exclusive asset, you don't need to. And so maybe people don't work as hard. It's typically why you see competition is associated with much better management practices because you're forced to. I think partly is also knowledge. So it's interesting. If you look back in the history of management and kind of industrial production, you see there's big innovations. In fact, some of them go back, like 200 years ago, where the British first early on in the Industrial Revolution, and then the Americans kind of jumped ahead of them. There's what's called the American System of Manufacturing. They worked out about repeatable processes and kind of standardization. And then the Americans were good about getting in incentive practices. Have you ever seen the movie The Founder? It's about the foundation of McDonald's. So the main character is terrible. His morals are awful. But the movie is really interesting about the foundation of McDonald's and his ideas and how to run businesses. So I think a second factor is it's just not obvious. If you look at the management grid that we use, the first time I saw it, it has these 18, it used to be 20, it's now 18 dimensions. And it goes on a 1 to 5 scale where 1 is terrible and 5 is amazing. For many of the dimensions, when I looked at the 5, I was like, wow, do people really do that? I had, for example, one of them is about continuous improvement processes. And it says 1 is when a defect happens, no one does anything. 3 is when a defect or a mistake or quality issue happens, it will be fixed and tried to prevent it in future. And that I would initially thought, that's great, that's like the best. But 5 exists, and 5 was, we have an explicit process called Kaizen that we regularly meet up and try and predict defects in future and try and avoid them happening before they occur. And we learn, it's like, okay, now you've told about that exists. I can see why that's good practices, but I wouldn't think of it out myself from first principles.
Yeah, interesting. I would think, given the high value of this and how learnable these things are, there would be more education about management. I mean, you and I both work at business schools, and I get the sense that management as a discipline is kind of past its peak. Like, in the 60s, if you got an MBA, you were like set up to run a division somewhere, and now you're like a level 2 analyst. Like, do you think we're just not teaching management enough?
No, so MBAs are still very valuable as, I think the returns to an MBA, they've gone up over time as far as I'm aware. But I mean, Revelio, you have better data on this than we will. But one thing is the playing field is rising all the time. So European, particularly North American companies are just really well run.
Yeah.
I was in McKinsey for a bit and I saw a bunch of their clients. And look, they're not perfect, and that's why McKinsey is there, but they're generally really well run. And so the kind of things you're dealing with are quite complicated. Like the last client I was with was a big retailer. We were basically doing randomized control trials, changing stuff in certain stores because it wasn't obvious what was good and bad. The other thing is, partly because of this, there's a big industry of fixing it. One group is consultants, and firms hire them in to turn around and kind of spread best practices. The other is actually effectively private equity. So there's a bunch of these private equity firms that their main thing is trying to identify, not even badly managed, I would say kind of moderate. I mean, like if you can identify a firm whose management practice is a 6 out of 10 and take it up to an 8 or a 9, you can make real money. And so as a result, there aren't a lot of badly managed American companies. From experience, if you go out to developing countries, particularly the data I've seen from kind of Africa, poorer Central America, some of South Asia, you can get some pretty terrible practices and stuff as, an American or a Brit seeing it, you'd be like amazed that it exists. But it's partly, if you're not exposed to it. So if you go back to Britain 100 years ago, the management practices of the firms back there were pretty terrible. And so you kind of don't, it's like Rumsfeld, it's unknown. So I think that is part of the issue. The level in the US now is so high that it's hard to improve upon it.
Do you think the way that this gets transmitted across countries could be improved? Like, let's say you were running the World Bank or something, and you could design programs or systems to pass along good management practices. Do you think it's possible?
It's certainly possible. And the World Bank, for example, does a lot of this. Often you have these issues with they'll try and go into some developing country. I mean, there's these famous examples of setting up big, like, nut shelling plants, and then they set the plant up and give it great management practices. You come back 10 years later and the thing's in ruins because some supply chain fell apart. I'm generally a big believer of, the power of private markets. Private equity firms have a huge incentive to buy up badly managed companies and turn them around, and they make money if they can improve the practices, and that tends to incentivize everyone. In India, where I visited and spent a lot of time working, you'll see one of the big struggles is on enforcing contracts. So I remember talking to a private equity firm that went in there and they improved the factory, said the performance was up, they could see the output was flowing out and things were looking better, but profits were down. And they were puzzled, and they discovered there was money leaking out, and stuff was kind of getting stolen, and they discovered it was this plant manager. I mean, they got rid of him, but they couldn't get the money back because the court system is too slow to kind of prosecute somebody. And so in the dream world, to transfer stuff, you want to just set up efficient markets with well-regulated contracts. I was advising the British government the other day on something related to this and said, look, if you look at the Premier League, the British Premier League is the most successful soccer or football league, depending on what country you're from in the world. Why? Because it's just very open to foreign money, foreign managers, and foreign players. And the more we do that for our own economy, the better we're going to do. So you kind of want to let high-skilled immigrants come in, and that tends to drive growth. And, if you let foreign companies buy up to badly run domestic companies, it tends to turn them around.
Right. And then even as people return home to their home countries, they sort of take that culture or management practice with them, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. And to be clear, in Britain, some of the takeovers, for example, Tetley Tea and Jaguar Cars, famous companies were bought by very successful Indian multinationals. So there's no it's basically the highest bidder. They typically tend to be well-run multinationals. So that turns out there's a huge literature actually on the impact of multinationals. It tends to almost always be positive. Enrico Moretti, Rick Hornbeck, Michael Greenson have a famous paper in the US looking at when multinationals come in. Not only do they improve the plants they're working in, but it spills over because it kind of flows up and down the supply chain. And it's primarily management practices.
It's so interesting and such a powerful mechanism. Let me ask you, I got one more question for you. What are you working on these days? I know you got a book in the works. Would love to hear about it. What are you working on and excited by?
So the book has just been there forever, but it is finally coming out. So it's supposed to come out next year, 2027. The putative title is The Triple Win, which is about how work from home is good for employees. They clearly like being able to work from home on average 2-3 days a week. It's actually good for firms because it increases profits by reducing turnover. And it's very good for society, reduces pollution, makes people better parents, get more time. You can live in nicer housing, etc. I'm also, like probably just about everyone else, looking at AI. About a year ago, I thought, I'm not really going to work on AI. It's not really my specialty, but it's becoming so everything. There's a famous Robert Lucas quote, which is, when you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. And I now think you could replace that word growth with AI.
Yeah.
That everything in economics is. And I know Revelio data is being used a lot for studies into AI. So the primary thing I've been doing is involved with various central banks surveying CFOs to ask about impacts on productivity and employment.
Oh yeah, you had that survey on adoption. I'd also love to hear about that survey if you're seeing anything interesting. I know it differs a little bit from the BTOS survey from the census. Yeah, what are you seeing? How do you think about ways to measure adoption?
If you want to look 10 years out, you want to talk to technologists out in Silicon Valley. So in the long run, it's all going to be driven by technology. But in the next 3 years, it's much more driven by adoption. So there's amazing AI technology already. It's just a question is, are firms using it and how? And so we wanted to get a survey of senior leaders, because these are the folks that really know what's going on across countries. And you can't really pay to do that because these people, they're too senior. And if you start paying large amounts of money to survey people, you tend to end up accidentally surveying bots and other things. So the view is, how do we access them? I'm working with some central banks, so the Fed, the Bank of England, the Bundesbank, and the RBA in Australia, to survey CFOs primarily, to some extent CEOs. And we just asked them effectively, what is the impact of AI being on employment and productivity looking back 3 years? and what do you predict it will be for the next 3 years? We have about 6,000 CEOs. This is a group, many of them we've been talking to for many years. We have this regular survey. The kind of strap line is, looking back, the last wave was early 2026. Looking back, they said basically no effect. So it's not that AI doesn't matter. Most of them adopted AI, but as of yet, as of kind of early 26, typical firms out there, these are not software firms. This is kind of spread across the economy and not seeing anything. When you ask them about looking forward for the next 3 years, they are reporting what for economists are really large productivity numbers. So they're talking about increasing productivity growth by 0.75% a year. So it feels like AI is about to have a really big impact. I'd say 26 feels like the kind of cusp year. Everyone knows that GPT-3 was released in November 2022. It's just adoption takes a while. Compared to other technologies, I should be clear, the rate of adoption of AI is incredibly fast, much faster than any other technologies, but it's just not instant. So that's kind of where we are now.
Yeah. Well, thanks for putting it together. And thanks for coming on to the episode. And for those listeners, follow Nick Bloom. I love your LinkedIn presence. So follow Nick Bloom on LinkedIn.
Ben, thanks. It's lovely to be on. And I'm, as we talked about just before we started, a huge user of Revelio data. It's amazing. It's, incredible data. It's pushing so many research projects forward. So my students, colleagues, collaborators, pretty much everyone I see is now using it.
Thank you so much. The Economics of Work is brought to you by Revelio Labs, workforce data for research and benchmarking. If you enjoyed, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. It'll help us reach other curious listeners. I'm your host, Ben Zweig. Our producer is Cole Wagner. Thanks for listening.